Yes.
Okay. Let me share my screen just before Christine gets started, and then you want to start, Christine?
Sure. So we are talking with you today about teens and motivation, what we can learn to nurture and develop their lifelong love of music. And every teenager is different. I always wonder if what I am thinking about and talking about with my own students and in my own studio and in my own experience can translate to a bigger and broader audience. And that curiosity is part of what led us to this topic today and together. We want to share with you our research with over 100 teen students over the last year. And we asked them some questions like what makes it challenging to play? What motivates you to play? And why do you love playing music? We also asked them to reflect back a little bit on their early years as musicians. I think it's really important to mention that our data was all collected pre-COVID 19. So we are going to address later in our presentation how you could take some of what we found and kind of apply it to our current unusual reality. But as you hear us present our data, just know that that's when we found all this information. We used anonymous Google surveys with our qualitative research with these teens, and we hope you find a number of useful ideas today, maybe some important reminders, and some things you can take with you as you work with the teens in your own studios and programs, or maybe even in your own household. So one of the things that came to mind to us as like a challenge for teachers, both for ourselves and when we are in conversations with others, is we may work with our teens in a classroom setting, in a lesson setting, and we see all their potential and all this enthusiasm from them. And then sometimes it's hard for them to maintain that motivation through the course of a week and come back having like maintained that in their practice sessions. So how do we do that better? How do we keep in mind what these teens need to keep that going? So Rebecca is going to give us a little bit more of an overview of our research next.
So we had, as Christine said, we had 122 students fill out our anonymous survey on Google. They ranged from, those who filled out the survey ranged from ages 12 to 23. And as you can see, it's pretty evenly split. As for those who filled out the survey, we decided we wanted to include college age students, so ages 18 to 23, because many of them grew up as young Suzuki students and musicians and thought that they would have a good perspective looking back. So the first question we asked them was, how old were you when you began your lessons? As you can see, we have a rather large percentage that started very young, so 23.8 for both 2 to 3 years old and 4 to 5 years old. So obviously quite a few PGP students, plus then the 6 to 7 age range, and then we get into maybe students who are slightly older, possibly starting in a school situation. And then we also asked what instrument they played. Many violinists, obviously, and then we have viola and piano second. Few ukulele and bass, not as common, but nice to see the range of students that were interested in playing instruments.
So this next slide is a picture of Rebecca and I with a panel of teen students from the Oregon Suzuki Institute. And for the past few years, when we were able to meet in person, we would hold this panel once a week during our institute with advanced chamber music students. And we had a room of parents and teachers, and these students would share their experience growing up as students. And we learned so much from hearing from them, and the questions we asked them were really informed the questions we were asked in our survey here, because we realized how valuable it was to us as educators to hear from their experience. So one more sort of slide here about who was included in our research. We asked, why did you start playing your instrument, to each of our participants? And the biggest number, as you can see, is I wanted to play. To me, I was just thinking, okay, these are students reflecting back. So, they may have a different view than they would have in the moment of starting, but I know many of my own students do want to play when they come into my studio. 58 respondents said my parents are the ones who wanted me to play. And then 15 students said there was a school requirement, and so I had to choose an instrument and play. And then you can see a kind of a scattering of a few other small small areas there. So that's who was in our research. And then we asked a few questions for students to reflect back on what was your experience like as a young student. So the first one was, what was motivating to you when you were young? And our top three answers were rewards and prizes, performing, and then friends. And I think it's interesting to me because I feel like there's a lot of discussion and maybe even debate about, are rewards and prizes a good thing, and should we be having them with our young students? And so that really is something that stuck out to these students as, okay, this motivated me when I was young. And we'll kind of look for that as we see what motivated them as teens and notice that's not really there anymore. So that's good to keep in mind. And then some of our other answers included music camps, attending concerts, parents, improvising, and just the music itself. So I think those top three especially are interesting to take note of as we work with our own students and studios. The other reflecting back question we asked was, what made it hard for you to practice when you were young? And there was a huge pool of answers here that practicing regularly, getting in the daily practice that we all know is so important, was really hard for these youngest students. And then the next answers, 36 said working with my parent was challenging. 33 of them said listening to the recordings was challenging, which is interesting. And then performing. So it was interesting that a group of them said performing is what motivated me. And then another group that says, oh, actually performing is what challenged me. And that rings true with what I see in my studio, kind of a mix of how performance is addressed. So that gives you a sense of that. And then we asked, when did you feel like you could really play? And this question came directly out of those teen panels from Oregon, because we wanted to find out from those teens, when did you go from, wow, everything about playing this instrument is sort of a challenge and hard, to when did you feel like, okay, I have some skills under my belt and now I can play and I feel pretty solid in my skills. So our respondents, 48.1% of them said this was being part of an orchestra. Some of them, it was their first orchestra they were ever a part of. Others said, oh, they were aiming for a certain level of orchestra at their school or in their community, and once they got into that, then they were feeling like they had some solid skills under them. Then 20% of respondents said technique. So some of them mentioned specific techniques like shifting or vibrato for string players. And once they mastered those, they felt like, okay, now I'm really playing on my instrument here. And then 18.5% said a specific piece of music. So a few that were mentioned were the Vivaldi Four Seasons or the Seitz concertos in Book 4. And that actually really lines up with what our panelists said about when they felt like they could really play. And then we have the segment that's 13.3% who said, I still don't feel like I can really play. And so when we dug into that a little further, most of the people who responded with this answer were in the 12 to 15-year-old range. And so I think they're just not quite there yet. Maybe they haven't made it to that orchestra or they're working on those techniques, and that's just a work in progress for them still. So that gives you a kind of a reflecting back sum up. And then we talked about what makes it hard for you to practice now as a teenager, what's hard. And so 78.8%, just the wide majority here, said time or homework. They mentioned things like theater rehearsals and sports practices and homework loads, and feeling really overscheduled was the biggest thing. And I certainly have conversations all the time with colleagues about how this is the hardest thing for us with our teen students, but it's interesting, they also see that this is a problem. And that's also what's challenging for them. And so to break that down into the other areas, we have some of them said, it's hard for me to focus, 44 of them. 23 said, I'd rather be with my friends or doing something social. Another 23 said, practice is boring. 18 said, scales and etudes are what makes it hard for me to practice. And then we have this miscellaneous category, which included both, I feel frustrated because I practice and I don't get better. And then also, I love practice, nothing's hard about it. And there was a few answers on each of those time frames. So when I look at this, I think it's really interesting because some of these things are going to be solved with maturity and better practice skills. And then other things I would say, oh, maybe that's on my list of what makes it hard to practice. And these are just kind of part of being human, doing hard things with our instrument. And we might think about how we could talk to students both about how to bridge the gap on some of these skill areas and also how we kind of work through some of these. I'm overwhelmed in my own schedule and I have to work to make time to practice. So some good food for thought there. So then we asked our participants, what motivates you now? So again, on this list, there's nothing about rewards or prizes, so I think we can take comfort in knowing that that's a temporary sort of boost in motivation for young students. 71 of our participants said friends were their biggest motivator. Next at 67 was their teacher. We were really touched by this answer because maybe our teens are never going to tell us, wow, you're really important to why I love my instrument. So to see it like this was really great as a teacher. And then performing was 66. And then below you can see chamber music and youth symphony and group classes. Those are all maybe similar to each other, but maybe they would fall into a I like to perform with this group or I like my friends in this group. I think those are kind of all interconnected. So that is what is motivating our teens now. And there was some miscellaneous answers like getting into college and seeing an improvement in their playing like that. So I just want to leave you from this segment by this great quote from Karen Hendricks' book, Compassionate Music Teaching. Music offers the possibility to balance their inherent need for individual accomplishment with the equally inherent need for community. And we really saw that in our data here. So I'm going to hand it over to Rebecca for a minute here.
So what I think is as Christine said, is most interesting is that students clearly have an interest in connecting with their teacher and their friends. I also thought it was interesting that they really connect with chamber music ensembles more than necessarily symphony and group class, and that connection that is so important to them, which, as Christine mentioned at the beginning, is challenging right now, is how do we build these connections when we are almost exclusively online, both for us connecting with our students, but students connecting with one another and their community. And so again, as Christine said, both with motivation, but also with inspiration, that teachers are at the top. And I guess this was something that I think is funny because it seems very obvious. I remember my teachers being inspiring, but I guess from week to week, I don't leave lessons necessarily feeling like, I just inspired everybody today, you know? And so to see that, it was really moving to realize that, yes, that their friends and famous musicians and orchestra, playing in orchestra and orchestra members inspire them. Really what it comes back to is the teacher, and that it's us who gets to motivate and share with them our love for music. And I think it's because of our love for music, the students leave invigorated, even if they're not showing it, they're clearly saying it. So in this survey, again, it was anonymous. They don't have to say anything out loud. And I think that's something that comes back to students a lot, especially teens and preteens. They're not necessarily going to say, you know, I feel inspired, or I love this music, or it was so great to have my lesson with you today. But really, this is a significant part of what inspires them and motivates them to practice. The other things, as you break it down for what they love about playing music, I thought this was also really exciting to see that the music is beautiful and makes me feel good. So I believe that was at 98% of people responded saying that, and that's huge, because I always assumed, oh, it's playing with friends and it's the connection to friends, and I need to make sure my students are really always, you know, having fun and being able to build those relationships in group class. But really it's something a lot deeper, that when we get to our preteens and teens, what they love is how they feel inside, not just the outward connection. That, and also the accomplishment of learning something challenging. That was, I believe, around like 87%, that the accomplishment of learning something challenging, again, they might complain or they might not be excited about what we've given them, but the fact that they can come away feeling like they've really owned something and conquered something and just feel like they know what they're doing is really moving. And then further down at 60%, we have performing in groups, playing with friends, and then a little lower, performing solos. Obviously, all these things are important, but it was definitely a lot less than those top two of accomplishing something challenging and playing music that feels beautiful to them, that they love. And I think that is also encouraging, especially right now while we are online, to realize that actually the top two things that they love are things that they do without other people necessarily. I know sometimes playing music with others can feel beautiful, but really what's important is, can we find repertoire that really is inspiring them, that they truly love? Because if we're finding something they can enjoy, maybe that's a little bit of light and joy and something they can find right now when things are hard. I mean, things are really challenging for kids and adults, for all of us right now. And so if we can find music that inspires them and makes them feel good and really connect with their deeper selves, that's actually the number one thing that they care about. And so, like I said, for me, trying to ask students what music they love, giving them lots of options. I do like that in the Suzuki repertoire, we all have this shared music that we play, but I've really tried to find other music, whether it's fiddle music or, pop music. I mean, just anything that students connect with so that they stay motivated and stay connected to the music, because these other things that we used to do so often are much harder to do. So really connecting with them, finding out what they love in that way. So that leads us to our next question, which I think, again, as I said earlier, is students don't necessarily give us the feedback we are curious about. And so we might be teaching and we just don't know, I think they loved this piece. I really think that they got into it, but I'm not sure. Or, just trying to really connect with students, because sometimes they aren't wanting to verbalize what it is they feel or think or want. And so one thing we did for this is I surveyed my students, high school and college students, and asked them if they could give advice to their younger self. What would they share? And so I encourage you to do something like this, or to do a survey and ask them, and you can tell them the survey is for another teacher that you're working with, or it's for something else, so that they don't feel like, oh, I'm asking you for this specific question. I'm asking for the greater good of other people. And I think students are much more willing to share when it's not, oh, there's pressure on me, you want to know what I need or I want. But if you're asking me to share what advice I would give, or you're asking me what kind of music I enjoy the most, and it's for someone else or for some other kind of survey, I found that students are more apt to share openly and feel like, oh yeah, I'm happy to write a little survey or answer these questions. And especially what's interesting about this is, with this question, I thought it was interesting because I had one student in particular who I love. I've had him since he was 3, and you'll see his advice is doing more listening, and this kid doesn't listen at all. And so it's things like that connecting with kids, and the fact that he gave that advice after I did this survey in, I think it was January, all of a sudden he started listening and he started practicing. So by giving this advice to other students, he was able to receive the advice that he wanted to give, and all of a sudden just thought like, oh, maybe I should do that. Like maybe that's something that would help me. So here's a little video, if I can get it to play, of students answering this question.
Find pieces that you love and listen to them as much as possible. Go to concerts and listen to people that you want to become. Also, enjoy composing. Try coming up with a song on your own.
Listen more, because that helps you learn faster, which then you can get to more awesome things.
Don't be afraid to break it down to individual measures or individual passages. You don't have to run through entire pieces every time you want to practice something.
Thank whoever's paying for your lessons and helping you to practice, because it really does pay off in the end, and you'll realize later on that it was all worth it.
The advice I would give my younger self is to practice every day and to find other people who enjoy playing instruments and making music, and to never give up, because every person I know who used to take music lessons and then stopped always regretted it. I've never met somebody who was glad that they stopped taking lessons. So just never give up.
Just keep going. Even when it's hard, it gets way better, and then you can show off your talent.
Good luck.
So like I said, what I loved about this is that students shared what was important to them. And I think that's a neat way to connect with our students, again, during this time, to find ways, what is the beautiful music they love playing, and what advice would they give to others? Because by learning what that is, I think we're seeing much more of an insight into our students, what matters to them, what motivates them and inspires them. and how can we do more of that or connect with them in that way.
Find people.
So we wanted to give you a few takeaways to kind of sum up some of our research. The first is just that performing was a big motivator for all ages, both teens and when they were younger. The next one is that you have a bigger impact than you may ever hear from your students. So as a teacher, just know how important your role is, even when you don't hear it directly from your students. We want to send you with that message for sure. Teens are highly motivated by connection, connection, connection. And that includes connection to the music they play and connection to their teacher and also connection to their peers and their friends they make through music.
We want to close by saying that it is our job to share the knowledge and all the technical aspects of learning music, but I think we all know this, and especially right now, is what we are wanting to do is connect them to the music and help them feel inspired, because if they feel inspired, they will want to grow on their own and they'll want to learn more. And so I do think, especially right now, help them find their passion, whatever it is. And so to reach out in that way and know that the beautiful music is really what is most meaningful to them. So thank you so much. And I think that leaves us with a few minutes for questions.
We have one question here. Is this survey of Suzuki teens or a variety of Suzuki and non-Suzuki teens?
I can start the answer and let Rebecca add to any thoughts she has. I think when we look at the ages of who participated and how old they were when they started their instrument, there's a lot of 2 to 5-year-old range of when they started. So I think a big chunk of this is Suzuki students, but we sent out the survey to be shared with students, to university professors and to Suzuki students alike. So there's definitely some mix, but I do think the largest proportion is Suzuki teachers and students.
Okay, great. And if anyone wants to write a question in the chat or use the raise your hand function.
I think we have a question from Alice Ann.
Okay. Or unmute and ask.
Can you hear me? Yes. Thank you for doing this survey. I think it's very interesting to use this kind of tool with teens because, as you said, they are not usually very forthcoming with their opinions. So it's a very interesting tool. So I do have a question about your survey. When you asked the questions, did you just leave blank spaces for their written out responses, or did you have places they could check, like suggestions, multiple choice or something?
We did both. Obviously for the questions about age, it was clear, like I started at 2 to 3, 4 to 5, that kind of thing. For the questions about practice, we gave, like I'm trying to think of which, if I can give you a specific one. But for example, like what made it hard to practice when you were young? For that kind of question, what we did was we gave a few examples, like practicing regularly, working with my parent, knowing from what both we've encountered with our own students in talking with other teachers and in the Institute panel that we did. We took some of those answers and gave them as possibilities. And then we always left a space where students could say other, and then they would write their own things. So we always ended up with a few other things that they suggested, but yes, we did suggest some answers which might have led them to answer one thing more often because, you know, perhaps they didn't think of that, but then they're like, oh, you're right, that is one thing. So, yeah.
Anyone else have a question?
I am keeping an eye on the chat, and I'll say that Christine and Rebecca, I don't know if you were aware that Dr. Karen Hendricks is joining us today, and she has said bravo and thank you for this very meaningful work. So she'll be speaking shortly.
Well, thank you for your wonderful work as well.
One thing I will mention, I don't know if we said this in the beginning, but we we did have some of our students take this survey, but we had students from all over the United States and South America. Some people, answered questions in other languages. So it was not just localized, and we wanted to be really careful of that because we did not want to just have a survey of what are Oregon students doing, so we did have them come from all over. I mean, we sent surveys. I think Pat had some of her students fill it out. So we were trying to get a very broad spectrum. And as Christine said, the majority is Suzuki, our Suzuki students. But we did want to just get insights from other students just to get an idea. But they're a wide range from all over the Americas. So, and then I saw Priscilla Jones asked, did we ask parents? We tried to do a parent survey, and I think parents are just a little too busy at the moment. That was our next step. But I think we got something like 30 or 40 responses and felt like we really wanted to put the bulk of our energy into the student responses and then possibly use that as a next step. So
Yeah, maybe for further research next.
yes. And it is not published at the moment, but we're working on doing that because we do recognize the surveys. It's helpful to see what is the broad spectrum and what is happening on a wider scale. So thank you so much for your questions.
Great.
Is there one more or a wave?
A wave.
A wave.
It's
Perfect.
Rhonda. Can you hear me?
Yes, hello. Thank you. For the sake of time, I think we now have to move on to presentation 2. So do we have Caitlin Smith here? Caitlin, would you like to turn on your video?
If somebody had a question, feel free to just message Christine or I, or even the group. We're happy. We'll be here for the next hour. So we're happy to continue to respond to questions if you want to reach out. So
Thank you.
Okay, Caitlin, I think you're on.
Okay. I have a handout. I'm just going to share the file in the text box before I get started here. And then I'll share my screen and I'll get started. Can you hear me okay? Does this sound good? Okay. So my name is Caitlin Smith and my presentation today is called Flipping Suzuki Learning. The concept of flipped learning was born in 2007 when Jonathan Bergman and Aaron Sams, high school teachers in Colorado, began recording their chemistry lectures for students who missed class. What began as a way to help absent students keep up with coursework turned into a revolutionary method of teaching. In the traditional learning model, students listen to the teacher lecture during class, then go home and practice what they learned. But in the flipped learning model, students receive content outside of the classroom, often in the form of online videos, then come to class to practice what they learned. In other words, flipped learning swaps in-class instruction and at-home practice. There are 4 pillars of flipped learning as identified by Bergman and Sams, and the first letters of these 4 pillars spell flip. So the F is for a flexible environment, the L is for learning culture, the I is for intentional content, and the P is for professional educator. So they describe that for a flexible environment, the teacher should be able to say, I provide students with different ways to learn content and demonstrate mastery. In terms of learning culture, in a flipped learning model, we transition to a more learner-centered approach, where in-class time is dedicated to exploring topics in greater depth and creating rich learning opportunities. As far as intentional content goes, flipped learning is not just videos. It encompasses the quality learning that happens during face-to-face time with students. So in other words, flipped learning isn't just making videos and assigning them to your students outside of class, but flipped learning is what using videos outside of lesson time allows you to do with your lesson time. And then for P, for professional educator, the role of the teacher may be less visibly prominent in the flipped learning model, but a professional, committed educator is essential to success. And during class time, teachers continually observe their students, providing them with feedback relevant in the moment, and assess their work. So how does the Suzuki method fit with flipped learning? According to Bergman and Sams, students need teachers most when they're stuck on a difficult concept or problem that in a traditional classroom often happens at home when the teacher is unavailable. This plight is familiar to Suzuki parents. Dr. Suzuki's proclamation that every child can does not hinge on parents' musical ability. Rather, success with the Suzuki method requires parents willing to dedicate time to consistent practice. Flipped learning aligns neatly with Dr. Suzuki's philosophy. The greatest power in flipped learning is the ability to individualize the learning for each child. Flipped learning is becoming more widely used in schools, but the Suzuki method has yet to see great involvement with flipped learning. However, many teachers are now adjusting their teaching methods because of COVID-19 and moving lessons online. But most Suzuki teachers use private lesson time to teach new concepts. Then parents and children reinforce these concepts in their home practice. Teachers often hear reports at lessons that parents and children did their best to do the assigned practice and repetitions, but could not remember how to do it correctly. This gap in retaining new information between lesson time and practice time is where flipped learning could greatly improve teaching and learning. In a flipped learning model of the Suzuki method, students and parents could watch video lectures at home, then come to private and group lessons for hands-on work and face-to-face interaction with their peers. This model frees the teacher to focus on specific students' needs, help those who struggle, and challenge those who are moving along more quickly. Flipped learning results in a space transformed into a dynamic, interactive learning environment where the educator guides students as they apply concepts and engage creatively in the subject matter. So I want to talk a little bit about my first steps in using flipped learning in my Suzuki violin studio. This year I started a blog called practicepizzazz.com, and one of the first posts that I put on there, one of the first video tutorials I created was a tuning tutorial for parents. And this was partly because of COVID-19, but this was also one of the first steps I wanted to take in flipping my Suzuki studio. And I do want to point out that since I teach a lot of young students, my tutorials so far are teaching parents just as much as they're teaching children. So I'll show you just a little bit of this video here.
Hey, this is Caitlin from Practice Pizzazz. This tutorial is for parents who need to tune their child's violin at home but don't know the best way to do it. I'm going to show you how to tune your child's violin quickly, confidently, and correctly.
Pluck the A string with your free hand while watching the tuner. The tuner will get confused if it hears more than one pitch, so you need silence to tune. And if you're using Tuner Lite, make sure you hit the tuning fork icon on the left first.
If you need a reminder of which string is which, if you're facing the strings, from left to right, they're G, D, A, and E.
As you pluck the A string, you need to check two things on the tuner. Number one, the letter and the number. These two elements go together. For the A string on the violin, the tuner should say A4, which is 440 Hz. The number after the letter just refers to the octave. If the A string is close to being in tune, it will say A4. If the string is way out of tune, it will probably say a different letter and maybe even a different number. If the tuner says B4 when you pluck the A, it is a whole note higher than it should be, so you need to bring it back down to A4. The second thing you need to watch on the tuner is the needle. If the needle of the tuner is centered, then that note, the letter and the number, is in tune. If the needle isn't centered, then that note is out of tune. Here's a chart I made to help you know what to do when using a tuner. And by the way, this chart is part of the free printable guide I created that you can download at practicepizzazz.com. The link is in the description box below. So if the pitch name A4 is correct and the needle is centered, then you don't need to do anything. The A string is in tune. If the pitch name is correct but the needle is not centered, then use the fine tuners. If the pitch name is not correct, then use the pegs. Should you use the pegs or the fine tuners? Use the pegs for big adjustments and use the fine tuners for little adjustments. So that's just a taste of that tutorial that I just put on YouTube. And what I do is then parents have that resource, and then if they have any more problems, then we use lesson time to fix it. But this way I don't spend lesson time, especially with online lessons, I don't spend the first 10 minutes coaching them how to tune their child's violin. So another way that I've been working to integrate flipped learning into my Suzuki Violin Studio is by creating a series of videos into an online course called Violin Repair and Care. And why do I focus on violin maintenance? Why was that one of the first things I did? Well, because I saw that teaching instrument maintenance is an essential part of teaching someone how to play the violin, but it can be a stumbling block for even the most talented students, parents, and teachers, even the students and parents with the best intentions. So I use videos outside of lesson time to teach violin maintenance so we can use lesson time as much as possible for playing. And I host this at violinrepairandcare.com, and I keep the videos very short, to the point, and I include just one teaching segment. The shorter length of the videos encourages students to actually watch the videos. And I'll show you just a couple clips from this series. The whole course that I made, it's a series of 45 videos. Here's the Violin Repair and Care homepage, and I've broken everything up into 5 modules so students and parents can find exactly what they need. So Module 1 is a quick start guide, Module 2 covers the bow, Module 3, the violin, Module 4, strings, tuning, and humidity, and Module 5, troubleshooting. And then I have some printable materials that students and parents can print and just slip into their case so they always have exactly what they need. So let me show you, for example, let's have a look at Module 5, troubleshooting. I took the most common violin repair and care problems that students and parents are pretty likely to run into, and I made a short video about how to handle each one, just explaining why they happen and what to do. So for example, let's say a student or a parent had a broken string, they would go Module 5 troubleshooting, click on broken string, find the video, and then they'd go ahead and watch it. Let me show you another little clip from Violin Repair and Care, just a segment. I've been able to take back a lot of lesson time just by having students and parents access videos with tutorials at home. So for example, let's go to Module 4, Strings, Tuning, and Humidity, and let's say there's a student who needs to put new strings on the violin. So what I'll do is assign them this video, how to change your strings, and they can also go ahead and watch the other videos to get context if they'd like. And they watch the video, it walks them through step by step. They can pause, they can rewind, they can watch as many times as they need to. They know exactly how to do it. And then one last clip. If you don't have much experience changing violin strings, don't panic. Follow these steps in order. Step 1. Sit down somewhere with good light. Have your new strings close by you along with a pencil. Write the date on each of the 4 new strings envelopes. Don't take all the strings out of their envelopes at once, or you run the risk of losing track of which is which. Step 2. Holding your violin on your lap with the button on your leg and the scroll pointing toward the ceiling, loosen the peg of the A string. The A string peg is on the right and top of the peg box. If you're ever unsure which peg is which string, just trace the string up to its peg. Loosen the A string peg until you have enough slack to totally remove the string. Only ever loosen one string at a time. Okay. The tension helps keep the bridge and soundpost from collapsing. Step 3. Take the new A string out of its envelope and put the old string in the envelope. So that just gives you a taste. That's just a little segment. There are more steps, but you can get the gist of what I try to do with those videos. So what are some benefits and challenges of implementing flipped learning, especially in a Suzuki studio? Well, one thing to know that I have discovered and read about is that technology use amplifies our teaching, for good or for bad. So it highlights our weaknesses as well as our strengths. I found that flipping reduces practice anxiety, and this is because I think students do the really hard stuff when they come to lessons, not when they're at home. Flipping gives parents more confidence to help. And this is a lot because the parents and students can watch the videos together and work together. And I think this fits really well, this idea fits really well with the Suzuki triangle of the parent being the at-home teacher. Children can pause and rewind their teacher, or they can watch videos as many times as they need to. And I think this is really helpful, especially for students who go at either a faster pace or a slower pace than the typical student. There's no embarrassment in watching the video a million times at home. There's no pressure to get it on the first try, which they might feel like in lessons. They might kind of beat themselves up if they can't get it right away or get frustrated. So this flipping with videos kind of takes the pressure off of a lot of kids, I found. One interesting thing is that flipping usually means more lesson time because we outsource the teaching new material to at home. So we have to have better in-lesson activities and even possibly reorganize how we use lesson time. And then lastly, making excellent videos takes time, which I have definitely discovered. And one solution that Bergman and Sams recognize, they talk about the difference between curating videos and creating videos. So if you create them, you make them from scratch, and the benefit is you can make them exactly how you want. But of course, that takes quite a lot of time and potentially money too, depending on what kind of equipment or software you use. When you curate videos, you use other educators' videos with their permission, and that's just as legitimate a way to flip your teaching as creating is. So what are my next steps? My results so far have been extremely positive. And I'm in the process of making more videos for my students. But as I say, this does take quite a bit of time. And I do want to point out that flipping a Suzuki studio or a classroom or anything does not have to be a giant endeavor that has to be done overnight. So for any teacher interested in pursuing the flipped learning model, don't do it all at once. You can start by just flipping one lesson, one piece, or one book. When deciding what material to start flipping, ask yourself what lessons your students tend to struggle with the most, then make a short video. Or ask yourself what you constantly find yourself repeating and start there. So in conclusion, flipping Suzuki teaching is a rewarding process that is helping me individualize my teaching and helping my students master material faster and more easily. Thank you.
Thank you, Caitlin. That was great. Great information. Does anyone have any questions for Caitlin? You can either unmute or put them in the chat.
Oh yeah, I see Mary Moser says, excellent. I've been doing this, but had no idea it was called flipping. Thank you. That's so funny because I kind of had the same idea. I had this idea that I thought was more brand new than it was. And then I started digging into the research. I realized there was a whole name for it and a whole community of educators with lots of resources to help us do this. And I think it's a really exciting thing.
Great. And we have another comment from Dr. Hendricks saying, thank you, Caitlin, some really innovative ideas. Any other questions? Okay. So we'll move on then to, this is a presentation by Dr. Hendricks and Jasandra Kono, and they will be talking about facilitating trust in preschool, a case study. Dr. Hendricks.
Hello, is everyone seeing the screen?
Yes.
Wonderful. Before I begin, just a thanks to the IRSTE team, Pat and Kate, for facilitating yet another wonderful IRSTE symposium. Just remarkable work, and it's an honor to present and to share in these ideas. And thank you to the previous two presentations that were very informative and wonderful. So much appreciation for that. So in this world where technology and globalization are happening at a rapid pace, our students have more access to information and music in their back pockets than teachers can provide after all the years of training that we've had as Suzuki teachers. There's so much that they can access, and our role is shifting in many ways. As we're teaching bow holds, we're also being able to facilitate and co-learn with our students. In this world as we're all continuing to learn and grow, learning and developing musically, and also, as Suzuki would remind us, in character development. We often talk in the Suzuki world about nurturing the souls of our students, but what about the ways that we are continuing to nurture our own souls? And the study that we're going to share with you today is a bit of a story of musical and human growth, not only for those that we are studying, but also of the process of the research itself. We're just delighted to share that with you. This all began at IRSTE 2016. This is where I first met Sachiko Izuhara, the executive director of the Suzuki School of Newton, Massachusetts. She approached me after a research presentation that the IRSTE research team had given on Suzuki group lessons and the development of empathy. Sachiko was interested in having research conducted at her school in Newton. And I was just starting my job at Boston University and was delighted to get to know more about the amazing work that was happening right there in my own backyard. But I was new to the job, and a couple of years went by before I got an opportunity to contact Sachiko. And then Madeline Bucci, an undergraduate in our music teacher licensure program, knocked on my office door, and asked if she could apply for an undergraduate research opportunity grant to conduct research with me. At the time, Maddie had absolutely no research experience. She was very limited in string playing or teaching background. She was a pianist. And although I saw her potential to teach anything, Maddie self-professed that she would teach any age except elementary or preschool. So, of course, the teacher in me thought immediately of the Suzuki School of Newton, where there were expert string instructors, and it was only one of two Suzuki-inspired preschools in the country. Not only would Maddie get to observe expert string teaching, but she would be able to immerse herself in the contagious joy of a preschool environment. I couldn't wait to get her to love preschool and elementary teaching. Maddie's first task was to read voraciously about the Suzuki approach, everything from Nurtured by Love to Suzuki-based research. And then we began observations at the Suzuki preschool with Sachiko's blessing and the support of the school principal, Deb Perry. The first study that we did of this school involved an in-depth observation of five of the tenets of the Suzuki approach. Every child can learn, group-based instruction, parent involvement, sensitive listening, as we called it, and prioritizing personal character over ability. It was a thrilling ride. Not only watching Maddie's interest in preschool-aged children develop, but also to be a fly on the wall in this remarkable school. As the study progressed, we became particularly interested in Walter, one of the preschool teachers who started as a classroom aide with no musical training and immersed himself so much in his work that he learned the violin along with the students. So just a little bit of background. This school is a preschool, first and foremost, based on the Suzuki philosophy. So there are teachers there who aren't necessarily music teachers. They're using the Suzuki philosophy for general education, but also teaching Suzuki violin lessons as a part of what the students learn. So an arts integration approach. As we studied Walter, I couldn't help but make connections between Walter and the approaches I discuss in my compassionate music teaching book. It was already referenced today. We concluded our research article emphasizing that we saw a compassionate co-learning that took place in the school, and we were determined to follow up with Walter specifically. Now, to the end of the story of the first iteration of this research, Madeline graduated, and as you might have guessed, being teachers yourself, Madeline has just begun her first year of teaching. Where? As a preschool and elementary teacher just 8 miles from the Newton School. I couldn't be more thrilled. But before Maddie left, she handed over her research responsibilities and files to Jasandra Kono, who's joining me today in this presentation, and who was heavily involved in the second phase to study Walter specifically. By the time we started our observations of Walter, he had been promoted from classroom aide and hallway monitor to a full-time faculty member at the school, just beginning his own sports curriculum inspired by the Suzuki philosophy. We observed how he both modeled and facilitated compassionate traits in his students while he taught them. So he was teaching sports using Suzuki philosophy and also continuing to learn violin along with the students and shadow them in the lessons, being what we expect and see in our older Suzuki students, or more advanced Suzuki students, I should say, who are helping and assisting one another and modeling for one another in group lessons. So for this study, we had a variety of data sources, including our own observations and field notes in the school, semi-structured interviews with Walter and with other teachers in the school, as well as the administrator, Deborah Perry. We reviewed Walter's teaching journals, which he generously shared with us, and we studied preschool artifacts, including Walter's sports curriculum and websites. And we coded data according to the compassionate music teaching framework and interpreted data as we went, and found that the most prevalent theme of all of the facets in compassionate music teaching was that of trust. So we have a little model here for you. You can see on the left, these are the facets, the qualities of compassion discussed in the compassionate music teaching framework in order: trust, empathy, patience, inclusion, community, and authentic connection. And Jasandra amazingly put these into NVivo and coded what we found in the various data and discovered that almost half, 43% of the data referred to trust. And we got really excited about that and thought, oh my goodness, let's recode according to 7 facets of trust that are discussed by Shannon and Moran and Hoy, which Jasandra will review with you in a moment as we go through. So our findings are that Walter was embodying these 7 facets of trust. And here they are for you on the screen, which he did to create environments of safety, collaboration, and engagement for music and sports. And these were things that he both taught and modeled as a co-learner along with the students. And we discovered that Walter was emulating these in his teaching as he was teaching students how to develop and express trust amongst one another. Okay, Jasandra, I'll let you take over from here.
Great. So just to give you a sense of what we were looking for and what we did find for each facet. With benevolence, essentially in a lot of ways, benevolence is kind of this kindness you show the students. But what we found was while you're perfecting skills, it's giving the students the sense that their emotional and mental well-being is really protected. We saw Walter do this where he would send pictures to the parents. And he found at first that the students were really not comfortable with him taking pictures of them. So he created games where it would be way more fun for them to have their photo taken so that he could kind of send this like progress emails to the parents. And so sometimes that was him like being a goalie. He also described one time where he had a hoop on his head and the kids would throw a ball on his head. And so creating this like really fun environment made the students more comfortable. The next one we'll talk about is competence. And so there's this, the student can't trust the teacher if the teacher is not good in their craft, which is pretty straightforward. But what we found was more interesting was ways that Walter created a sense of competence within the students and their own, which led them to trusting their own education and trusting themselves a lot better. And so he usually did that with guided questions. And that was both in the sports class and in the music class, where he would ask things like, where's your bridge? What does a safety lock look like? And so creating opportunities for the students to practice their own competence can also have them create trust within themselves. Next one, yeah, confidence. So confidence is this, we put like a rest in uncertainty is what Karen actually wrote in her book. And that's kind of this sense of the creating this assuredness that this, like if you present a sense of assuredness, the students know that they have something to rely on. He expressed this when he was talking about, we found a very perfect example when he was talking about the former sports program and how he looked at it, and we have it quoted here. He said, I can do this better. And so showing this sense of, it's really trust in himself that he can do better and that he can create something better. Showing that trust in yourself gives the students a security, knowing that if you trust yourself, maybe I can trust you too. Next one is honesty. Honesty we find is really important with feedback. And so being really honest in feedback and detailed in feedback makes it really clear to the students where their progress is in whatever goals you're trying to achieve. And so we had a situation with he had a student who was really competitive in the sports class and really wanted to have create like competitions. He always wanted to play a game that was a competition. And there would be situations where he would allow the student to be competitive and play in some sort of competition, and the student wouldn't win and get upset about it because the student didn't actually want to compete. The student wanted to win. And so he would sit down with the student and kind of just explain like, well, you decided you wanted to do this, and we tried it, and this was the result. And that's what's going to happen with these games. So being really clear in where the student is makes the student very assured in their progress. Openness is, so with openness, Dr. Hendricks in her book kind of references Lee Higgins' safety without safety. And so this is creating a safe environment to explore new innovations when there is, even when there is a possibility of failure, creates kind of an open environment. Usually openness is shared with the teacher showing their own personal vulnerability. So there's a lot of connection between openness and vulnerability. And with Walter specifically, we found that instead of him maybe telling stories or like describing things, he would actually kind of share the weight of vulnerability with the students. And so we found an example where a student in sports class he had really long hair, and so he'd run and he couldn't see, or he couldn't participate in sports. And so he talked to the mom and was saying that, you know, either he needs to get a haircut or he needs to have something, he needs to wear something so that his hair's out of his face, whether it be a headband or barrette or whatever. And so he offered, if the student didn't feel comfortable with that, he would do the same thing. He would come to class wearing the headband with him. So this kind of shared weight of being vulnerable with the student is what we saw with him. Reliability is this creating a sense of stability and predictability. This often, because it's preschool, so they're really young, this often was just, you know, he would help them, he would be really strict with any sort of schedule. So if he said, next week we're going to do this, that's what they would do. Or he was often the person who would bring them to and from classes. And while it's just, even though they're just these like small moments of predictability with time schedules, it shows the students that the teacher's word can be trusted, which can lead them to trust kind of larger expectations. And then the last one is vulnerability. A big proponent of vulnerability is this sense of interdependence. And so something that we found in one, or something Walter had said in one of the interviews that we just loved, was written here. And the other thing that Suzuki said is that I always hold on to is that I strive every day to learn from children. We love that so much. That was such a great and such a very clear description of Walter and his teaching. He so often is basically just a big kid. He's kind of this, like, he plays all of the games with the students. He always demonstrates, he always models what the students are doing and what their expectations are. And when you are kind of becoming a big kid with the students, there's a sense of you're being vulnerable because you're letting go of a little bit of control, but creating this sense of interdependence with the students lets the students know that we need them just as much as they need us, and we trust them as a member of our musical community. And so we can't gain trust with the students if we don't show that we don't trust them. So that's what we found with those 7 facets.
Thank you very much, Jasandra. So you can see that we chose to study Walter because he was uniquely positioned as a Suzuki preschool teacher who had very limited musical experience. So here he was immersed in this world of music teaching in a Suzuki model, but not a trained musician himself. And he was just thrilled to learn. And it was just delightful to watch him as this, as we said, big kid, as he said himself, grow along with the students in his musical development and model for them in ways that Suzuki has advocated for us, the importance of modeling and mentorship. And his willingness to do this as this big kid with professional boundaries, as he said, created this situation where he could model these learning strategies simultaneously with social emotional dispositions. And we found that this exploratory study paves the way for further research on compassionate co-learning in music learning settings, particularly in the ways that teachers might utilize the 7 facets of trust to foster learning spaces wherein the students feel empowered as learners and as musicians, while also developing these facets of trust in their own lives. And quite fittingly, The research assistant baton is being passed here today as well. We went from Maddie to Jasandra, and Cheryl Fries, who doesn't know I'm going to mention her, is also here today, who has put together these slides for us. Thank you, Cheryl. This fall, she and I, as Jasandra is preparing to do her student teaching at a strings program very near where Maddie is going to have her first year of teaching. And Cheryl and I will be studying the next phase, which is a study of the salience of trust between teachers and students, and comparing differences in the ways that teachers versus students perceive trust and these 7 facets of trust. So I'm excited for that. And Cheryl and I will be back in 2022 with findings to share. Thank you. We'll take some questions now.
I think we have some questions in chat. One of them was, did Walter eventually get any Suzuki certifications? That's from Jenny Shaw.
Yeah, not yet. I imagine he will be. He had just started learning. He had started taking Suzuki lessons himself. So he'll be working on that. And he's at this point teaching sports with a Suzuki philosophy. So he'll be going on that. Help me out with just this, Jasandra. The school, the kids are what age start? They start at age 2.
I think
some of them.
3 to 5 is
3 to 5. Okay, so we have some 2 turning to 3, and then 3 to 5. Yeah. Okay.
And with the Suzuki certification, he's not certified, but all of the teachers had to take, I think, the initial class.
Every child can class.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Any other questions?
I would love to jump in with a question. I would be curious, as you've watched this novice learn and grow and build these Suzuki skills, do you think there are explicit takeaways for trained Suzuki teachers who are already practicing or building a studio?
As we're watching an adult?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, one thing from the research specifically that comes to mind is just the power that Walter had as a teacher by allowing himself to be vulnerable. He made mistakes all the time in front of the students. You know, sometimes he'd have the pancake hand or the pizza delivery hand, and he'd be like, "Oh, look at me." You know, he was not afraid to show them that he was making mistakes, which created this climate of trust and openness with the students, where they felt like it was okay for them to make mistakes and they could have fun in the process. Quite often, we are a little bit too perfectionistic as teachers, and we feel that we have to model perfection. And of course, we have Hillary Hahn with recordings showing that model of perfection. But how wonderful for us as well to be able to show them that we're all learning, we're all growing, we're all developing as well. Jasandra, anything to add to that?
I think something we found, even though you're asking about professionals, was that Walter also acted as a really good model for this kind of Suzuki parent sort of setting. And so looking into it that way, he almost acted as the Suzuki parent in the classroom as this aide.
Yeah, that's a really important insight, Jasandra. This was a preschool, and we think of the Suzuki philosophy and the idea that parents are always there in the lessons and then practicing at home. But we had so many, I feel like a part of the community, they had so many parents who would drop the children off at the beginning of the day. And so we were concerned, how is this going to play a role? And Walter really played that role as the teacher, as the surrogate parent in a way, helping out and then communicating to the parents at home.
Thank you. Fascinating.
That's important, especially, you know, as we think Suzuki's idea of parent involvement came at a very different time and in a different country than the United States. And we think of all the challenges that United States parents face in 2020. And there were a lot of ways that we can incorporate alternative approaches to the parent model.
Thank you. And I think we had a question come in as well. Barbie says, I love that Walter is using the Suzuki philosophy in sports. Is there anything happening in the sports world that would encompass the Suzuki philosophy?
Yeah, what he did was specific to the instruction. I think of things like small steps, and how we think about how we could spend a whole year, depending on the age or other factors of the student, with just the beginning rhythm of the Suzuki, you know, the first twinkle variation. And he was doing the same thing by breaking tasks into very small steps and repetition, and then building on that. So he was thinking of it as a pedagogical approach, thinking that these approaches, as Suzuki said himself, could be applied to any context. And I just, wouldn't it be amazing thinking about Suzuki's words, cooperation, not competition, and how that fits with sports or doesn't fit, and how we might look at ourselves as a classical, typically classical performers, with this competition element that Suzuki was not as interested in, but how we can bring that atmosphere of support to even the most, as we say, competitive settings, and the ways we can support and learn one another. I see a comment, we need to be more inclusive of the varieties of families. Absolutely. Yeah, and that, I think the IRSTE team has been interested in some research on that as well, but certainly there's more for us to do in that area. Could we comment on the difference between being vulnerable and engaged versus letting yourself be run over by the students? Oh, what a wonderful question. And I'm going to step aside from this study for a moment and talk about something I mentioned in the Compassionate Music Teaching book, in the chapter on patience, actually. And the idea that and I learned this first from Pat Dercoli, actually, so I'll give her credit for this. But the importance of patience being curiosity. And there are moments where we're vulnerable and letting them know that we're human, and also being curious as to why there might all of a sudden be a disruption in the class. And rather than saying, oh no, I have to put on my armor, we can instead say, curious what's happening right now. What do we need in this moment? And making that shift. But it is, of course, so important, as Walter said himself, to have those professional boundaries. And when we talk about being vulnerable, it may be something like putting a hair clip on or showing a mistake and then saying, oh, here's how I'll fix this, rather than simply sharing our deep, dark secrets with them or getting overly emotional and losing control ourselves. So having a bit of self-awareness in all that we do.
Just to add to that, I think David Elliott talks about that as thinking out loud, revealing our thinking to the students so that they understand the process that we're using to become better at whatever skill. It kind of builds on what you were just saying, and there is that difference between being vulnerable and being run over and having those professional boundaries.
And I think that goes back to the competence piece as well. If we're demonstrating competence, then it's different than us saying, oh, I messed up again. Oh, this is horrible. It's not that. We're showing competence, but we're showing growth and learning, as Pat just said, thinking out loud.
Are there any other questions? Great presentation. I'd like to thank you, Karen and Jasandra, for a wonderful presentation and some great ideas, and highly recommend Compassionate Teaching, Karen's book, and really glad that you could be with us today. as all of our presenters. Thank you to Christine and Rebecca and Caitlin for sharing your projects with us as well. Just a couple of announcements before we close. We are off to a great start and welcome you all back on Wednesday. We have a little bit longer session. It will be in the afternoon and evening, depending on what your time zone is. And it will consist of 4 presentations. So we'll talk about a Suzuki parent survey, effect of different instrumental accompaniments on intonation, some things about a project about the bow and does it fit, and mindfulness for musicians. So if that piques your interest, we hope you'll come back and join us for those sessions as well. And am I missing anything, Kate?
No, that will be our session on Wednesday. So we look forward to sharing more research presentations with you from across Canada and the United States, including a presentation by Pat and myself and our colleague Yoon Cho, some work that IRSTE team has done. And then I think we can just mention that Friday also is a very exciting wrap-up session for IRSTE.
Friday. Okay. And also, do you want to say something about the proceedings?
Sure. So for anyone who's interested in more information, the detailed abstracts and summaries for these presentations, contact informations for the authors, or a copy of the detailed schedule, the conference proceedings are temporarily available to download from kateenerson.ca at the page IRSTE 2020, and I've put that link in the chat. As of next week, they'll also be available on the main IRSTE page, which is at irste.org. You can find information to register if you'd like to share it with colleagues and invite them to join us on Wednesday or Friday. And please also feel free to contact us with any questions. We're so thrilled to have you here. This is a record-breaking registration for us.
Yes. And just a reminder that the sessions will all be recorded and the links will be sent to you after the last session on Friday. So you can look forward to those if you happen to not be able to stay for the whole thing or miss the session entirely. So I think those are all the announcements. We're really happy that you're here and we look forward to seeing you on Wednesday. Thank you very much.